So, hello everybody. Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me for sure here in the room because I can hear that myself. But if anybody from the online people could give me a sign that you can hear me, that would be
fine.
good.
It's fine. We can hear you.
Super, thanks. Very good. So it's my great pleasure to open the second HEAS keynote lecture here. And you might remember the first one was on anthropology. We had Katarina Haberti and Mirjana Roksandich talking about Southeast European findings. And the second now is centered on archaeology, like the motto, according to our motto in HEAS, as you know, that we want to study the biological and cultural evolution together in one framework. So we are switching between more anthropology and more archaeology. We continue this series with one guest, a very distinguished colleague that we have from University of Tübingen and the Kurt Engelhorn Center of Archaeometry in Mannheim. The famous Professor Ernst Pernicka is with us today, and we are very glad that he accepted our invitation and giving a talk today. Imo Trinks will introduce him in a few moments, but I would like to take the chance to say a few words. Of course, I thank all the people that were involved in the organization of this event, like Imo, of course, and Maeve, of course, my assistant in HEAS, and our computer specialist, Martin Dockner, and Fabian Siegel, and many others. I have to apologize that we had this switch in time and location, but you know that it is difficult in these days of COVID to estimate the number of people who would join in. And so we had to switch to another room in the last minute, which was not available before. But I'm glad that we have about, I don't know, 60 people here in the room and about 80 people online, which is a very good sign. And there are still people dropping in, very good. So most of you might have seen our webpage and are probably a bit familiar what we do. And it's my great pleasure also since the last meeting that we had in April to announce that we have now new partners. So we were 7 units from the University of Vienna that you know, but now we have 2 new partners to external. The one is the Natural History Museum from Vienna. And since a few days, also the Austrian Academy of Science is our partner. So we are very happy to have these 2 powerful organizations with us, which extend, of course, significantly our potential and the scope. You have probably also discovered, meanwhile, that we have a new line of activity in HEAS, and that is the HEAS seminar series. We have 3 of them. One is in paleogenomics, that's led by Ron Pinhasi. One is for human evolution and the Paleolithic, led by Tom Hyam. And one is for archaeology, led by Imo Trinks. We have the funds to invite 10 speakers per academic years for each of these series. And they are also streamed online, so also people from abroad can attend them. We had already really great talks, and this is a very good means of getting together, getting to know each other, and of course, build new collaborations. So if you are interested in the seminar series in taking part, please see our website. And a last point related to it is we have the HEAS newsletter. Please join in and sign up for the HEAS newsletter if you're interested in our activities. It's accessible on the first page of the website. There's monthly a newsletter telling you what are the upcoming events, but also important probably, we give an overview about our publications, about our recent publications, and you are able to access most of them in full text via our website. And last but not least, there is another action, the HEAS workshops that we will start now. And there is one, the first one on geometric morphometrics that will take place on December 14th. So mid of December. And if you want to get in touch with modern kind of analysis of shape and form, go to the website and look it up. It's an online workshop, so it's a one-day workshop. You just need a computer and a mouse, basically. Also good, a second screen. And you can do it from your home office. But now I hand over to Imo, and I'm very much looking forward to the exciting talk by Ernst and a lively discussion afterwards. For those people who are in the room, we have then a little reception afterwards with some wine and snacks here in the Mensa area. Thank you. Imo, please.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm very pleased to introduce today for the HEAS keynote lecture Ernst Pernicka, Senior Professor for Archaeometry at the University of Tübingen and Senior Director of the Kurt Engelhorn Center of Archaeometry in Mannheim. Actually, our guest has been born in Vienna and not only went to school here, but studied as well chemistry at the University of Vienna. His doctoral studies dealt with analytical investigations of ceramics. After his PhD, he established a laboratory for thermoluminescence dating of archaeological ceramics at the Institute for Analytical Chemistry at the University of Vienna. His habilitation in analytic geochemistry at Heidelberg University researched ore deposits in the Aegean and their exploitation in antiquity using geochemical investigations to determine the provenance of archaeological metal objects. He was appointed associate professor at the University of Heidelberg in '95, and in '97 he received a call for a professorship in archaeometallurgy at the Bergakademie in Freiberg and held his inaugural lecture together with Professor Korfmann and Professor Kajan and Professor Klinkott on Troy. In 2004, he was appointed professor for archaeometry and archaeometallurgy at the University of Tübingen, and under his leadership, the Kurt Engelhorn Center of Archaeometry was opened in Mannheim. Since 1990, he has been the coordinator for scientific investigations of inorganic finds at the excavation of Troy, and since 2005, he became the director of excavation at Troy, a position that he held until 2012. He has significantly advanced research on metals, their production, trade, and use. The prestigious ERC Advanced Grant was awarded to him researching tin isotopes and the sources of Bronze Age tin in the Old World, which resulted in important new insights into the tin trade during prehistory. But this is only one of many examples of his extensive, very extensive research activities. Ernst Pernicka has been the founding member and head of the Gesellschaft für naturwissenschaftliche Archäologie, Archaeometry, and was member of the board of trustees of the Vienna Institute for Archaeological Science. And he is member of the scientific advisory board of the integrated platform for the European research infrastructure on cultural heritage. He was managing editor of the journal Archaeometry, and he is probably the most renowned expert in the field of archaeometry and archaeometallurgy. Since 15 years, there has been an active collaboration with the colleagues from the new HEAS partner, the Academy of Sciences. And my colleague Matthias Mehofer at HEAS had the pleasure to be supervised during his PhD. And there has been an active collaboration for the past 20 years. Matthias and I have often talked about the latest findings and publications of Ernst Pernicka regarding some quite controversial archaeological finds from my home county, the infamous Bernsdorf gold and amber fakes. In addition to determining the age of finds, Professor Pernicka is primarily concerned with analyzing and researching the origin of ancient metal. And it is in this context that he will talk to us today about the famous Sky Disc of Nebra, an exceptional as fascinating Bronze Age object uncovered by treasure hunters and rescued from the black antiquity market. I'm very much looking forward to an exciting lecture and on this extraordinary find and the discussions surrounding it. Please, the stage is yours.
So good evening also from my side. First of all, I thank you all for the invitation. You probably know that I never decline an invitation to Vienna because I like to come to my hometown all the time. And also thank you for the friendly introduction. Now, presently I feel a little bit in the position of the fifth husband of Liz Taylor, who reputedly said on the occasion of their marriage, "I know what to do, but I don't know if it's interesting." So the reason is because I have talked about the Nebra Sky Disc in Vienna several times, and many of you may have heard parts of this already before, but so you have to bear with me. You also have to bear with me. You have heard that I'm actually grown up in Vienna, and you have to live my Viennese English. I hope you understand it nevertheless. Now, here we go, if this works.
Bitte lauter.
If noch lauter.
Ja, bitte.
Ja, wird kommen. Und die Maus die funktioniert schon.
Vielleicht ist das Mikro ausgeschaltet.
Ja, ist es? Ja.
Ist besser, danke.
Yeah, okay, now we are set, it seems. Okay, so what you first see is what I will not talk about. I will not talk about the original Germanics and not about the Druids, as in the initial publications in the press suggested. No, we are dealing with a Bronze Age object, which is about 1,000 years or even more earlier. Now, to say more about the exact dates for those who are not so familiar, because we are speaking in the center of biology, where we are in the time. Here we have the Sky Disc of Nebra around 1600 BC. It's contemporary with the shaft graves of Mycenae, which we have recently, the gold objects analyzed that you see here. And it's earlier than Tutankhamun's tomb. Now, why do we know this? The reason is that, first of all, archaeologists are very familiar with those types that you see here, the swords and the chisels and so on. And the swords belong to the earliest swords also in Europe. And it turns out pure archaeological means, you would date them into the developed early Bronze Age of Central Europe, which also is in the around 1600 BC. But in addition, we had the chance to perform a radiocarbon date in one of the handles of the swords, where some birch bark was remaining. And again, this yielded a date of 1600 BC. So it is well dated. The question is, the swords date the object, namely the most interesting object, the Sky Disc, and this is unique. There's no parallel that has ever been found, and therefore it was questioned from the beginning on if it is authentic. Actually, I will come to this in a minute. The first question that I was asked by Harald Meller, who was then the newly appointed director of the state official museum in Halle, and a state official of Sachsen-Anhalt for archaeology, if this was authentic. Now, first, let me show you the site, because you may not be familiar with the little town of Nebra. It is in the south of the federal province of Sachsen-Anhalt in Germany. You can see here on the map an approximate location. It was found not on a mountain, and in Austria we would not say Mittelberg, it's a hill, but it is a hill that has a very good view over the northern German plain. You can see on clear days the Kiffhäuser and other landmarks. So it has for a long time been apparently a place for cultic activity. Now, as I said, from the beginning on, the authenticity of the disc was questioned not only by the Kronenzeitung, but also by archaeologists. And because, as I said, there is no parallel known of it. And therefore, the first question also by Gerhard Weber to ask me was if it is authentic. That was in 2003, actually. Here we have an article in the Kronenzeitung 2005. This was when a court suit was going on the authenticity and on the dealers of this sky disc, because it was not excavated in a controlled scientific archaeological excavation. Now, I think, and I will show in a minute, that we have effectively rebutted the accusation that it is a fake, a modern fake. But later on, other archaeologists claimed that it is not so old as we thought, the early Bronze Age. Because if I go back, as I did forget about the significance of the Sky Disc of Nebra, namely, it is since 2 years part of the UNESCO memory of the world. So it has a similar status, similar importance, like, for instance, the Gutenberg Bible, or the first script of the 9th Symphony of Beethoven, and so on. So it's something considered very important. And of course, it is also claimed to be the earliest representation of the night sky, namely the astronomically correct representation of the night sky. Now, if somebody claims it is not as old as we think, namely 1600 BC, early Bronze Age, Central European chronology, then like the Times, they say, okay, if it is much younger, then it should not be more in the UNESCO memorial, part of the UNESCO memorial pieces. And here you see the Times, oldest map of the cosmos is brought down to Earth. I don't know if you see here, the Earth is missing here. Anyway, this was a new accusation, again brought forward by archaeologists, and it also made it in the New York Times because it is an important object. And it says here, quite rightly, it is a tale of bronze, iron not so much, but looting and archaeological conflict. Bronze, we see the sky disc consists of low tin bronze. It was only about 2.5% tin, but it is a story of looting. Namely, here we have the looters who were identified by the police, and their instrument is here. They found it by systematically searching for valuable material in the ground, which they could sell on the flea market, usually some remains of the Second World War or something like that. And initially, they did not recognize that it is an archaeological object. They thought it is the cover of a vat. And therefore, they hammered on it and partly destroyed it, or at least damaged it substantially. Now, these were people, here is the original looting hole, partially filled, but it was identified because the man on the right side was collaborating with the police, while the other one on the left side, until today, claims that the sky disc was not found there, but somewhere on the flea market in Prague. So anyway, the reason for this is the value, of course. The looters themselves because the instrument that they used was not their own ones. It was given to them they had time, they were jobless, they could go in the forest and look for some valuable things. So the owner of the looting instrument gave them in the order of 30,000 German marks in those days. It was a lot of money for those people, but they got it because there was some gold on the Sky Disc. And of course, this man tried to resell it to other people who had more interest and more knowledge about such archaeological antiquities. And eventually, the disc and the whole hoard was sold for 230,000 German marks, which is quite a rise, almost a factor of 10. And then this owner tried to sell it for almost 3 times this price. So the increase within a few years is interesting. But he was unfortunate in that Harald Meller was hired by the police as a collaborator. He claimed that he could buy this hoard or this disc together with the swords. And so this man, the second owner of the hoard, met with Harald Meller in Basel in Switzerland and wanted to sell him for $700,000, but German marks. But the police was behind it, so this owner was arrested, and that was in the following. The case, the court case, came about in around 2005. Well, nowadays the insurance for the transport of the Sky Disc, when it was first shown in Vienna, was 100 million euros. And, and the second exhibition, which was taken place in Mannheim, then the insurance that was insurance value was considered 200 million euros. So you see, there is a lot of money in this gray market. It's actually, according to the police, the antiquities market is one of the big illegal markets like weapons and drugs and so on. So it is something that to consider. And therefore it was of course very important to see if it is really a fake, because a fake would then be a few tens of German marks value, and here now we have millions of euros of value. It was interesting that in those days I was I had already developed a test for copper-based objects, lead and silver, that would test if the metal was produced within the last 100 years or so. That was initiated by a court case in Heidelberg when I was still at the Max Planck Institute for Nuclear Physics. And as you heard, I'm a geochemist, actually radio analytic geochemist. I was well aware of the uranium decay chain. And here you have the uranium decay chain, which uranium decays via various intermediate elements or nuclides to lead-206 eventually. And it happens, and this is the geochemical part of it, that the decay products with very long half-lives, like radium, but also thorium and protactinium, are elements which we call lithophile. That is the proportionate, the partition into rocks, in siliceous rocks, and not so much in metal. On the other hand, we have in the blue field nuclides, which of elements which we call chalcophile, which means sulfur loving. These are the elements that are to be found in sulfide deposits, for instance, but also in the smelting of ores, they end up in the metal. So what we see here is the long-lived isotopes on smelting end up in slag. So you have an artificial separation of the long-lived radionuclides from the short-lived radionuclides. The result of such a procedure, smelting of metal, is that the metal phase that is produced is always slightly radioactive. The radioactivity comes from the longest lived nuclide in this blue rain, namely lead-210. And lead-210 has a half-life of about 22 years, 22.5 actually. And after 5 half-lives, we have only 3% of the original activity left, and we cannot detect it anymore. So that's our detection limit. That means that if we find an object that is radioactive, it is definitely produced within the last 100 years. If you don't find activity, then it is older than 100 years, and it then is usually authentic. Now, we cannot date beyond 100 years, but with the Sky Disc, it was, so to say, highly likely that it is authentic, because that would have meant in those days that in the late 19th or the early 20th century, somebody would produce such an object. This was a time when the fakers, forgers, usually forged Greek and Roman antiquities, but not Central European prehistoric objects. Anyway, we have, this is the result of the activity measurement. You see here on the lower panel, the activity of modern tin, metal. The left signal is only an indicator because you have to separate the lead-210 chemically, and this indicator in a signal shows the efficiency of the separation technique, the chemical separation technique. And therefore, you see only the indicator signal in the Sky Disc, which was then only called star disc, Sternenscheibe, but no activity in the interesting part of the diagram. So we were pretty sure that it is authentic, but we have tested another dozen of parameters if we would find an indication of forgery. And with the absence of such an indication, the probability that it's authentic is, of course, highly increased, proportionally increased. Now, concerning the find location in some detail, what you see here is the find location itself. And there was a large-scale excavation going on after the find. And we have tested the soil if it would leave a signal of the actual location of the disc, because, as I said, the two looters did not agree in their testimony to the police, and there was a difference, and that had to be resolved. And what we find is if we compare the copper and gold concentrations in the find spot with the ambient concentrations, which you see in these red quadrangles, where we have taken the background samples. And here you see in 2004, I think, the excavators on the right, Harald Meller, then the newly appointed director of the Halle Museum. And you see also with the shovels who did the work. Anyway, here we see the find location, and indeed it was possible to find the actual situation here. You see the refilled looting hole with dark huminous material. And we had samples from all parts of this filling, and we found the highest copper concentrations and also the highest gold concentrations at the bottom of this hole, which was the original soil cover on top of the basement rock. And this means that the gold and the copper was partly dissolved from the material that was lying here, of course, bronze with gold, and was absorbed by the lower level of the undisturbed soil. So that was pretty secure indication that here was lying a mass of copper objects or bronze objects together with gold. And we do not have so many early Bronze Age copper objects that are combined with gold. Therefore, this was consistent with the tale, at least the testimony of one of the looters, and we were pretty sure that this is the correct indication. The damage on the disc also is consistent with the testimony, namely they said they had performed the excavation not with a shovel or with brushes, but of course with a hammer. And because they didn't know what they would find, the hammer traces are here in red and in blue, so different parts of the hammer. The Sky Disc was standing up in earth, so the blue the damages from the hammer before they had excavated it, and the red ones were after they had excavated, was of course covered with soil, and they hammered a little bit around to find out what it is, and therefore they damaged also the round of gold object. Okay, this is the reconstruction how the Sky Disc together with the accompanying finds were deposited. They were not thrown away, they were deposited. And what is the looter who collaborated with the police confirmed that this was about the situation that they found. Only these two swords were lying with their tips against each other. So we are I'm very sure that this is the situation that was very close to the original situation. And we are very sure we are dealing with early Bronze Age material. Now, here we have one of the looters who even showed on the site how it was deposited. You see the Sky Disc in the uncleaned and unrestored situation during the lawsuit in court in 2005. Well, the next question was, of course, we had dated archaeologically and physically with radiocarbon the swords. The question was, do the objects belong together? Because the accusation was, of course, the swords and the chisels, and so they are authentic, but the Sky Disc was added to it to make the whole hoard more expensive. And this was the result of the chemical analysis, some minor and trace elements. You see nickel and silver, antimony, arsenic, gold and silver by X-ray fluorescence and neutron activation analysis. And you see that they are close together. So the Sky Disc is always in the middle of the distribution of these data points. The data points are from the accompanying material. And we would conclude, yes, they all belong together, but they are not from a single cast, because then the variation would be much smaller, but we can say it comes from the same type of deposit, or maybe even from the same deposit. So this, we had already known this pattern from other studies. We have an archive of some 50,000 chemical analysis of Bronze Age and Copper Age and objects from all of Europe into the Near East and Middle East. And if we use this data bank to look, where do we find copper of the same chemical composition with the same trace element pattern, we find that this type of copper is distributed north of the Alps into the Carpathian, basin, and we on the one hand, so in the east-west direction, and you see a south-north direction. So the this type of copper is also found in southern Scandinavia, and there we know there is no copper deposits at all in Denmark. There are copper deposits in central Sweden, but they were not used in the Bronze Age, as we know. So this was a very clear answer, and I'm happy, or was happy that we started off with a chemical analysis, because we usually combine, or the provenance analysis usually based on lead isotope analysis. And here we have the lead isotope ratios in the usual way, namely, sorry, oh, now I made a mistake. Maybe you can help me again. Anyway, I can continue. The result of the lead isotope ratios was very surprising, because the variation of I can go through it. The variation of the lead isotope ratios was drastic. It was here we go. Here we go. You see a variation that is huge. Just to give an example, we have, this was the start of this application of isotope analysis in archaeology. When we analyzed, for instance, the very large lead deposit, lead silver deposit of Laurion in Attica in Greece, the whole deposit had a range of variation of lead isotope ratios that was smaller than one of the symbols. So we have huge variations in this material of the Sky Disc. And the answer was only after we had access to the samples of the Mitterberg region, where we had suspected it would come from the chemical analysis. Because although the chemical signature of ore deposits is very opaque, you see here that, for instance, arsenic and nickel have variations over 3 orders of magnitude, but arsenic and nickel are correlated in the ores. This has a mineralogical reason, because a certain mineral contains arsenic and nickel, and it is contained as an accessory mineral in the ores to various degrees. So generally, again, from the chemical composition, would say, okay, it is likely that this copper comes from the Mitterberg region. And here we also have the lead isotope ratios, and it turns out that the Mitterberg copper ore is chemically relatively homogeneous, but isotopically very variable. This can be explained because the copper deposit of Mitterberg also is associated with uranium minerals, and that means that you have such a variation to expect, because the uranium decays over the time the deposit is existing, and increases the variation. I cannot explain this in more detail, but if you want to ask afterwards, I can explain this. So in addition, we find very similar variations in copper-based objects of the early Bronze Age of Central Europe, which are also clearly associated, can be related to the ore deposit of Mitterberg, which is a known Bronze Age copper mine. I will come to this a little more, namely here. We know that the ore deposit of Mitterberg, the copper ore deposit, was mined in the Bronze Age and then was abandoned. It was only reopened in the 19th century, and therefore we have the chance, and Clemens Eibner is here and Thomas Stöllner have worked a lot in the prehistoric mines that are still accessible there. And it is clear that the mining of the Mitterberg may have begun in the 18th century BC, but it also ended in the 10th or so century BC for unknown reasons. Anyway, this again is against the notion that was suggested as I said in the beginning, that The hoard is much later, namely some in the early Iron Age. That would be in the after 800. After 800, this type of copper was no more produced. This is also shown in a cemetery nearby. Bischofshofen is actually in the valley below the mountainous mines of the Mitterberg region. And you see that the copper ore that is was buried in the cemetery of Bischofshofen. Pestfriedhof is totally different from the copper that is found in Nebra, and also from the copper that was produced in the Mitterberg region. So we can rebut this again, and we are now again confident that we're dealing with early Bronze Age material, and we know from where it is. So let me briefly comment on the production technology, because that was originally also one of the features that we tested if it could be a modern forgery. For instance, if we would have found that the gold was applied electrolytically, then we would have a clear indication of a modern forgery. It is not, because the gold applications are applied with a relatively thick leaf that was fastened within a groove. That was and the rim of the groove was then hammered back. So this is how the gold was applied. And you see on the lower panel that even changes were made. Namely, one of the gold stars was removed when you may remember that on the picture on the sky disk also contained two horizons. One gold horizon is still there, the other is lost, maybe taken away. But when the horizon was fastened, this is the lower part of the panel, they had to move the star. And it is interesting, and we will see this, I will comment on this later. It would be interesting to analyze also this very tiny fragment of gold in this groove after which was left when the new star was applied. So Heinrich Wunderlich of Halle Museum, the chief restorator, was able to reconstruct the fastening technology with tin bronze chisels. It is the tin bronze of the sky disk is relatively soft. It can be worked with a hard tin bronze of, let's say, 10 or 12% tin, and this is what you see here. And the modern product looks very similar to the old product, but it is of course gold on copper. And we think that this sky disk is actually motivated because in the early Bronze Age, we don't have so many gold bronze objects that have gold applications, very few actually. That this was initiated, possibly initiated by the polychrome metalware that we find in the shaft graves of Mycenae. Remember, the sky disk is contemporary with the shaft graves of Mycenae. And we were able to also study the metal structure, and the metal structure tells us about the way it was treated before it was deposited or used. And this is visible here in this metallographic section. Namely, you see some of these light newly formed crystals that have so stripes within their volume. These stripes are called twins, recrystallization twins, and these form when the copper or the alloy is deformed and reheated. On those occasions, such twins are formed. So if you then again deform the copper, which is of course necessary, you can deform copper to a certain extent, but then it becomes brittle and gets fractures, so that you have to make it soft again by heating tempering this alloy. And here the fact that the twins in the recrystallization twins are straight means that the last action that was taken on the sky disk was the heating and not the hammering. And this means that we have to deal with a dark disk, because if you heat copper or low tin bronze in fire, let's say to 500 or 600 degrees centigrade, so dark glow, it oxidizes and becomes black. And this is, of course, a much better, aesthetically much better appearance. And it also makes more sense because it is a representation of the night sky. But if you do this only by heating, then the color is not very homogeneous. And one could assume, and actually we have had a PhD study on this, if there was artificial coloring. And indeed, you can achieve a very homogeneous black surface color by inserting the copper disc into old urine. That was the only basic liquid that was available in the Bronze Age. And this may have indeed have happened, we see on the swords, because the swords are bronze swords. This is the yellow part of these, but in the middle you see also some green lines. And these green lines are inlays of pure copper. So you have copper inlay in a bronze sword. And if you want to make this more visible, you insert it into urine, and then the bronze becomes yellow and the copper becomes black. So that's one possibility. We can, of course, not prove this because all this surface material on corrosion tends to be lost. Anyway, but we could explain the color difference in the sword, because on the top left-hand panel, you see that the gold on copper does not really make much of a difference in color. Well, what do we actually see on the sky disk? And here we have had help, collaboration with archaeoastronomists, another field of archaeology. Here we have Wolfhard Schlosser, who unfortunately recently died, of Bochum. He identified, he found out that if we assume a center of the sky disk and measure the angle that is formed by the horizon that is surviving, but we have another horizon on the opposite side of a similar size, we measure an angle of 82 degrees. That's strange. If you make an arithmetic division of the sky disk, you would have a 90-degree angle or a 60-degree angle, but not 82. What does this 82 mean? Well, these 82 degrees are exactly the difference of the sunrise on the solstice, summer, on the 21st of June, and the winter solstice. And then the next question would come, how can one construct an angle of 82 degrees? This is very easy. We have here a much earlier ring structure at Gozek, late Neolithic, and you see how the people worked. They only observed the rise and the sunset in the winter days, and then they made a hole here, as you can see, which is where the sun only shines through on this one day in 21st December, and they do the same in summer on the 21st of June, and then they have the angle that they can transfer to the to the sky disk. So this is an indication of systematic astronomical observation of the sunrise and sun set. Here we have another site where we have a similar astronomical observatory, namely Pömmelte, again in Sachsen-Anhalt. And these poles are not irregularly oriented. They are oriented as a result of the archaeological excavation, where you see the post holes of the original post holes. And again, you see on the left, on the right side here, such a watch hole for the sunset or the sunrise on specific days. Here we can also assume that we have, if we use it for orientation, and I said the Mittelberg in Sachsen-Anhalt is the last hill in front of the very flat North German plain, and you see certain, you see certain landmarks like the Kiffhäuser, where the sun rises just on a certain special day, and this was similarly observed. Well, the second feature that is indicates astronomical knowledge in the early Bronze Age is this group of stars. These are 7 stars, and these are used as this is astronomically identifiable as the cluster of stars called Pleiades, and they are usually used for as a astronomical mark for the because they appear in October, and they are not visible anymore in March. So the appearance and the disappearance of the Pleiades mark important dates for the agricultural year, the sun year, namely March, where you have to sow out your fields and your crop, and in October, where you have to bring it in. And these Pleiades are also shown in contemporary seals in the Near East, but never together with sun and moon, because each child, when we show it to what do you see here, they said, oh, we see sun, moon, and stars. Yes, so we think this is the crescent moon and the full moon, or the sun and the Pleiades. So this is astronomically correct, because we okay, I'll come to this later, but first of all, we asked, is there another message hidden on the sky disk? Is the order of the arrangement of the stars something that should tell us? And Wolfhard Schlosser then made an experiment. Here is the sky disk in the middle green without the large objects and without the Pleiades, and 25 stars are left. And then he used a computer to arbitrarily distribute 25 stars on the remaining space. And you see, this is what we see in the night sky. They are not equally distributed. You see some clusters of stars and so on. That's what we see on the night sky. But if you ask people to distribute 25 stars in the free areas of the sky, they usually try to distribute it equally, homogeneously. Only one person here on the left may have had some psychological indication here, this one, which resembles the computer simulation. Anyway, so we think there is no further message, but recently I got a message from, we get many messages, by the way, and usually from the United States combined with the claim of a patent, but most of these are taken away in the, well, in the file of crazy things. But here we have one recently only an indication that something else could be there, namely one of the stars, and I think it is this one, is a bit larger than the rest of the stars. And this user, and I'm not an astronomist, but he said this could be one of these stars of that would indicate the ecliptic in the sky disk. but I cannot go into detail, and I'm not an astronomist that I have a problem with those explanations anyway. Here we also analyzed, it was not easy to analyze the sky disk. Of course, you can use X-ray fluorescence. Even nowadays, you could use handheld X-ray fluorescence to analyze this, but then you only get the major components, because X-ray fluorescence is not very sensitive. So we used other types of X-ray analysis, for instance, PIXI, proton-induced X-ray emission at an accelerator in Rossendorf near Dresden. And then even more fancy was the use of synchrotron radiation combined with X-ray fluorescence at the BESSY, the Berliner Elektronensynchrotron, to analyze the gold objects. And we found that the gold objects are not of the same composition. We find three groups of objects, namely, I hope you can see it. We have the bulk of the stars, and then we have the sun and the moon. And okay, I go through it. Yes, no problem. Yeah. And we have a third group of objects, namely the horizon and the one moved, a star that was moved or removed and replaced. Here we go. Sorry, yeah, here we go. So what you see is that this one star that was replaced, probably together with the horizons, because the second horizon would overrule the one star, so it had to be replaced. And this is a similar gold which has slightly higher tin concentrations. So we see an order of events in the sky disk. So initially, it did not have any horizons and no bark. It only had 32 stars and sun and moon. And of course, the sun and the moon, especially the moon in the crescent moon in conjunction of the Pleiades. And then the sun observation was added, but it damaged, or at least it actually destroyed the original message, to which I will come in a minute. And then the sky disk changed probably its role, because a boat was added, and this boat we relate to the Egyptian mythology, where the sun gets on a boat in the evening and rides through the underworld and rises again on the next day from the underworld. So this is the sun bark. That's our interpretation. Some people have other interpretations, but I think this is the most likely one. And then in the end, it was partly destroyed because we did not find the second horizon, and the sky disk was also again used for something else, because you cannot see this so well, but you see it on the number 4 panel that there were holes drilled into the rim of the sky disk, 39 holes, and it was apparently fixed to some organic material, probably wood, to have another function, maybe a cultic function, while in the first, in the number 1 appearance, it was probably only a memorial disk. And this is why we believe this is here. The crescent moon is relatively thick. It is about 3.5 days thick, if you can see this. And this can mean that it is a memorial to how would I say, to remember that every 3 years, if we want to have the sun calendar and the moon calendar in conjunction, you have to insert an additional month, because the moon year has only 11 days less than the sun year. Now, the sun year is important for the survival of the community because you have to sow out your crop in March and you have to get it in October. But the sun year is not very good for measuring the time because you have only 4 days, 2 dates, the summer solstice and the winter solstice, and the equal days in March and in October. So if you want to have a time measurement for short distances, then the moon is much better because the moon changes every day and everybody can see it. So in ancient societies, the moon was the reference astronomical object for measuring the time. But if you use the moon for measuring the time, again, you have not 365 days, but 354. And after 3 years, you have a difference in those calendars of 1 month. And this would mean that if you use the moon calendar also for determining the time when you sow your crop, then you are wrong, because then you get into February for sowing out the crop, and the community would not survive. So this is an important feature that we find, and it is something that is not so totally new. We know this from a text only of 800 BC of a Mesopotamian text where exactly this feature, namely the reference of the sun and moon calendar, and that you have to insert into the moon year 1 month, 1 additional month every 3 years, is written down. And this text is probably a copy of much older text. So we know that in Mesopotamia, astronomy was an important part of the culture and of the rules, like in Egypt, that Pharaoh was not only the ruler, but was also a god, because he could predict the Nile flood, which was essential for the survival of the community. So if we accept this astronomical interpretation, then of course the sky disk was an observation, is the representation of the observation of a night sky and of a rule, of a calendrical rule. So it's a memorial disk and not so much a cultic disk. Now, interesting thing is that this symbol, sun and moon, is also used in other objects now much later. The Eberswalder hoard, early Hallstatt period, probably 800 BC. And you see all these rounded circles symbolize the sun. And we also have moon symbols on the disk. And the interesting part is that we have 22 sun symbols and 1 circle in the middle and 10 concentric circles in between, which means we have the number 32 and number 33. And this means, it may be speculative, but it could be that 30, this is different, 32 sun years actually are 33 moon years, and almost exactly. And maybe it was possible to calculate this from the observation of a few years. This is speculative, but anyway. Now, we have determined the provenance of the copper. It comes from the Alps, even if there is much copper in the much nearer, in the Harz Mountains, in the Erzgebirge, and even in the Sangerhäuser Mulde, which was the largest copper deposit up to the 19th century in Germany. But all these could be excluded by chemical and isotope analysis. But the provenance of the gold was another feature. Where would this come from? Now, the analysis of gold is constrained to chemical analysis, because gold has only 1 stable isotope. So there's no possibility of isotope analysis of gold. But again, in the Württembergische Landesmuseum in the 1970s and 80s, about 5,000 objects, prehistoric objects, of gold objects were analyzed, and it was found that their chemical composition, again, their trace element pattern, was not equal over all periods and all time or all regions. And it turned out that you could form, or you could classify the analysis into different chemically similar objects. And if you look at the distribution of these chemically similar objects, you find that there is much gold in Denmark of a similar composition as in Ireland and in the British Isles altogether, which is, of course, again, an indication that the gold in Ireland must come from somewhere else and probably from England. So what would they exchange for? And the one suspicion is, of course, they would exchange it for amber, which is quite abundant, even on the western coast of Denmark. Anyway, so we had a number of comparative data available, and we analyzed the gold of Nebra with laser ablation mass spectrometry, a much more sensitive technique. And initially, we thought that the gold would come from the very rich gold deposits in Romania, in Siebenbürgen. The golden quadrangle, is it called? But if we look at the classification of the Hartmann, we find that this group of objects can be subdivided into the yellow ones, which are really distributed in Romania and Southeastern Europe, and another group, which are the white ones, which are distributed in Central Europe and in England. And this was the first indication that the gold may not come from Southeastern Europe. And indeed, what we find is that the gold on the Nebra disk actually comes from England, which again was a great surprise to archaeologists, as with the copper. But here we have an overview of the comparative analysis of gold that we have obtained in the course of our studies. And the best fit we find in in Cornwall, in southwest England. Here is the variation, the spider diagram of the variation of the gold of the Canon River in Cornwall and the Sky Disc samples. You see that we have not analyzed all stars, and actually in 2 weeks we will have the possibility to analyze them. But first I want to show that it's not so out of the world, because Cornwall is known for its tin deposit, but the tin deposits usually also contain gold. And actually gold was mined in Cornwall, not only for, mining was not only for tin, but also for gold. It was only not mentioned in the geological literature because gold in England automatically belongs to the king or the queen. And so if somebody finds gold in Cornwall, he doesn't report it, because otherwise he has to give it away to the king. But we have indications that mining was going on there already in the 16th century BC. Here is such a pick that was used to hammer up the gravels in this Canon River to get the gold for panning the gold. Now, I just, as an offside, I would like to show that we have, in those days, we had to take very minute, but still we had to take samples from the gold objects on the Nebra disk. Therefore, we could not analyze all of them. But now we have a technique where we use a laser for taking samples. It's a laser beam is focused on the surface of the object, and from there some material is ablated, and this aerosol is collected on a filter and then analyzed in a laboratory. And we had the chance to analyze gold from Troy. As you know, I have been excavator of Troy, and I'm still the director of the Troy project in Tübingen. And the result was interesting insofar that the Troy gold and its composition was not only very similar to a similar site on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean Sea, just 60 kilometers away from Troy, where we also have, a large number of gold objects were found of the same period, third millennium, middle of the third millennium BC. And we find that this gold is similar, is not differentiable from gold from ore. And this reinforces the contact between Western Anatolia and Southern Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium, not only by shape, as you see, we have quadrangular spirals, pendants, which are very, very similar, but we also have the chemical composition, which is very similar. And if we look where this gold would come from, we have, of course, very close regions, gold-rich regions like Western Anatolia, even near Troy, there's a gold deposit, and Southeastern Europe in Bulgaria. But we could exclude those by the chemical analysis and made it more likely that the gold derives from Caucasus, so that we can see a globalization in the 3rd millennium already, in the globalization of the so-called Old World in the 3rd millennium. Let's go back to our object, the Sky Disc of Nebra. We have analyzed and determined with some probability the provenance of the copper from the Alps. We see a provenance of gold from Cornwall. Where does the tin come from? The question is, of course, that the major tin deposits in Europe are in Cornwall and the Bretagne, and in the Erzgebirge, very close to the fine spot of the Sky Disc. There's also a little bit of tin in the Slovak mountains. There's lots of tin in Iberia, but these are far away. And so it was, of course, assumed that the tin would come from the Erzgebirge. And therefore, we developed a new method, namely the analysis of tin isotope ratios. This is not so clear cut as the analysis of lead isotope ratios, because the natural variation of lead isotope ratios is due to the decay of radioactive precursors, namely uranium and thorium. Tin does not have such radioactive precursors, but we are now so sensitive with isotope analysis that small natural variation in the behavior of the tin isotopes can be discovered and quantified. And the original publication in 2010 seemed to indicate that we can differentiate it between the Erzgebirge, these are the red data points, and Cornwall, these are the black data points, with one exception. This is the blue one. This is from the Czech part of the Erzgebirge, the Graupen. So the complete differentiation was not possible. And later, when we came to the Sky Disc, it turned out, nevertheless, it is more likely that it comes from Cornwall, the tin, and not from the Erzgebirge, with the exception, as I said, Graupen. Now, within this project, ERC project that was mentioned, we could determine many more samples, and indeed, it turns out that we cannot really differentiate between Erzgebirge and Cornwall, but there is a tendency that the Cornwall data, again, the black data points seem to tend towards the right upper hand corner, and the Erzgebirge to the lower hand corner. And the Sky Disc remains up there. And it is different from most of the agnetids, contemporary agnetids material or alloys that we find in the region of the Sky Disc. So we assume that the tin of the Sky Disc derives from Cornwall, but the Erzgebirge seems to have been used already in the Bronze Age, which can be indicated here indirectly. Anyway, so we have the cultural situation here in the first half of the 2nd millennium. We have on the left side, on the Atlantic Rim, the bell beaker cultures, and on the northern right-hand side in the northeast, the coded ware culture, and the agnetids culture is right in the middle, where these two cultural regions intermix. And it seems that we have here a region which has already some social differentiation, because we find that the sky disk itself has been deposited, but that not only the sky disk, but also leaders were deposited, of the leaders of the society were deposited in large mounds, like here in Leubingen, and in the vicinity of Leubingen, here a very large hoard with hundreds of axes was identified, and the grave itself was filled with offerings, and therefore we can assume that the position of the sky disk was probably contemporary with the last leader of this society around 1600 BC, because this is the end of the Onyadits culture. And it is maybe no coincidence that the copper supply that we can identify from 500 analyses of copper and bronze objects from Denmark, that the copper supply changed with time, and that exactly around 1600, the supply changed from Mitterberg region to other regions, mainly the Trentino in northern Italy. And we also find that initially the most important sources were in Slovakia and in England, and were then replaced almost as a monopole from the Mitterberg region, but only for 200 or 300 years, and then later replaced by material from the Trentino in northern Italy. So thank you very much for your patience, and hope I have presented something new, even for those who have heard this presentation already 3 times. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions in the audience?
Yeah, I want to come to the last aspect that you talked about, the provenance of the tin from Cornwall. You showed that other Onyadits objects do not have this tin.
Yes.
So in this respect, the tin of the sky disk would be very special. What is the case for the gold? I mean, you have shown the rich barriers, or part of the rich barriers, which do contain gold. Do we have the same phenomenon there, that the gold in the tombs is of different provenance than the gold of the sky disks? And what would be your interpretation of those differences between the sky disk and other objects?
We have analyzed the gold from Leubingen and other of these very large burial mounds, and indeed they are a little different, but not much. So the type of the gold is more or less the same. And you know, with the gold provenance, we are not as clear-cut as with the copper objects, where we have a parameter of chemical analysis and isotope analysis. In gold, we have only chemical analysis. And it seems that the gold is in the early Bronze Age is relatively similar in all these Onyadits graves. Yes, so it's only the tin that is so special, and it's also the copper that is special, by the way, because most of the Onyadits metal objects do not contain copper from the Mitterberg. It is only after the fall of the Onyadits culture that Mitterberg copper reaches Denmark. Okay, before it was, oh, it doesn't show anymore. Before the Onyadits culture, as you know, ranges not only in Saxon-Anhalt, but into the Czech Republic, close to the mines actually in Slovakia. So it is possible that the early period of copper supply to Denmark was actually controlled by the Onyadits culture. After the fall of the Onyadits culture, the pathway was free for Mitterberg copper up to the north. In the Onyadid culture itself, Mitterberg and the Sky Disc, the hoard is an exception, like the tin. So this must, it indicates that the whole hoard may come from the south. No, it's okay. Okay, yeah. Here we go. This is what I mean. Here we have on this panel, we see that it's not only the Onyadid culture very prominent in Sachsen-Anhalt, but also ranges into the Czech and Slovak republics, very close to the Slovakian ore mountains. Okay.
Any further questions in the audience? Do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. And you talked about the production process of the disc. Is there any indication on the craftsman's side who actually made this this disc?
No, there is of course not a memory on the disc who made it, but we see that in these burials of the, let's say, leadership persons, which are buried in those huge mounds, they always also contain tools for metalworking. So the metalworking seems to be a craft of the higher levels of the society. And especially here, the Sky Disc, it contains some knowledge which was not widely available. So somebody who produced the Sky Disc was the master of time, the master of the calendar, who guaranteed the survival of the society, of the community. And therefore, we think that this was made by somebody of the leading members of this already stratified society. Yes, there's an additional aspect to the production of the Sky Disc, which I could not show because there's many things that I could show. But I mentioned that a bronze with 2.5% tin is relatively soft. It's not as soft as copper, pure copper, but it's not as hard as a real tin bronze with 10 or 12% tin. So what we see on the back of the Sky Disc is a groove that doesn't make sense other than a test groove. So somebody who produced the Sky Disc first tested on the backside if the chisel that he or she used actually was fit or usable to produce such a groove to fix the gold applications. That's an interesting aspect. So we see that these people who produced the Sky Disc were not yet sure if they could actually produce it with their own tools. Yes, and this is why we think that the initiative to produce such a polychrome object in metal was initiated or instigated, triggered by the knowledge of the polychrome works in metal in the Mycenaean culture.
But you mentioned that the disc had different kind of manipulations over time. So is it obvious that this was only one person who made this disc, or could it be that it went through different kind of production processes?
Yes, actually, we think that the change over a relatively short period of time, because as I have shown, the production of this type of metal did not occur before about 1800 BC. And the Sky Disc was laid down in 1600 BC. So even if we assume that a generation changed between each of these 4 steps, then it means that the social stratification of this community of the Oniadis culture was not very stable, because this person who made the Sky Disc to memorize the necessity to insert an additional month in the moon calendar after 3 years would not have been happy with the change of the appearance of the Sky Disc later on. So we think this must have been in the 2nd generation. And again, another generation then added the boat, or maybe the same generation, where they worshipped more or less the sun and accepted or introduced the concept of the sun boat on the Sky Disc. And later on, it was used in a different way. So we have 4 stages of the Sky Disc within about 150 or so, 200 years. Indeed, this is something that leads one to the supposition that the social stratification and there was not a dynasty, but maybe a very unstable situation of this social stratification.
I pass on to Gerhard.
Thanks. We have here a question in the chat, and it says, how does one constrain, in light of the 3rd millennium globalization,
yes,
the mining ore sites to Europe? What is the possibility of future mining sites being discovered outside of Europe, contributing to the metal makeup of the Sky Disc?
So it is the question if we find ore deposits which are in their chemical and isotopic parameters similar to the Sky Disc here outside of Europe. Outside of Europe means the Near East or Middle East. Okay, as I have indicated, the knowledge, or we think that the knowledge of this astronomical knowledge that is laid down on the Sky Disc may actually derive from the Near East, Middle East, Mesopotamia. How this came about, we do not know, but as we have seen with the gold, there must have been communication, contacts over large distances. You have between Troy and Ur, you have 2,500 kilometers, and they have the same type of pendant. They use the same type of gold from the same source. So there must be contact, regular contact, and that may have gone beyond the Aegean, where we see the Aegean was part of this old world globalization, but it may have spilled over into Central Europe sometimes. Yes, so the knowledge may indeed derive from the Near East or Middle East. It is not very likely that we find copper deposits which have the same chemical and isotopic characterization, because we know already a lot of the Eastern Mediterranean on the Near East. We do not know so much about Iran, but we know we have analysis of most of the known copper deposits in Turkey, in Jordan, in the Arabah Valley, in Cyprus, of course, and in Greece and Southeastern Europe, and they all do not fit. So it is, I would say, unlikely that we find a similar set of parameters outside Europe to identify the possibility of an origin of the Sky Disc in the Mediterranean or the Near East. Actually, initially, because of the boat and because of the similarity with the Greek mythology of the sun boat, the Egyptian mythology of the sun boat, we were we did not exclude the possibility that the Sky Disc was brought as a whole object from the Eastern Mediterranean to Central Europe. It would have then less meaningful because it would be more or less something that a tourist brought with him. But since it is actually made from material that is in Central and in Western Europe, it is only the knowledge that was transferred, possibly transferred. The knowledge of polychrome metallurgy, polychrome metal objects, and the astronomical knowledge.
I would like to add on here with a question for myself. This is an English, Middle European, German co-production, if you so wish.
Yes.
That's what we see from the materials. Stonehenge, there is astronomical knowledge also involved, as far as I'm not an archaeologist. But could the knowledge also come from England? So the material and the knowledge somehow were exported to Middle Europe, and someone there had copper from Austria and they made this thing, or they exported even the...
It is not out of the world, but I would argue in the other direction, because near Stonehenge, that was a very interesting find. A burial was found of two male persons, apparently high status person, because they had gold earrings, I think, and weapons, bronze weapons. And so initially, the excavators of Stonehenge interpreted this burial as the king of Stonehenge. Yes, and then the teeth were analyzed for oxygen isotopes. It was turned out it could not have lived in Great Britain. Okay, somewhere in Central Europe, maybe at high altitude. And so this and the metal that they had with them, it was analyzed only in England and not with the full range of parameters that we use. But that what I've seen would rather speak for a Central European origin also of the metals. So maybe these were visitors or what have you of Stonehenge, and they may have brought the knowledge there. It is, of course, not out of the world, but it only shows that Stonehenge shows, as well as Gozek and other such structures, and the Sky Disc of Nebra, that astronomy or astronomical observations were already around also in Europe at the very early periods. It's only that we do not have the literal record, the written records that we have in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any further questions in the audience? A very fascinating find, a very fascinating topic. Are there any further questions in the chat?
No, as far as I can see, no.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, this is the one that you read. Okay, so thank you.
Fascinating to see what archaeometry and archaeometallurgy can tell us about the origin of the source materials and the connections that existed already back in the Bronze Age. I think I would have more questions, particularly as well, why some colleagues would think that this is from the Iron Age. But I think to address these, we would need a glass of wine. And therefore, I would like to invite everybody here to the small reception outside. Those in the online sphere won't be able to join here, but they are therefore encouraged next time to come in person if possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
I thank as well all the people who attended, and online and in person. And I'm wishing you a good weekend. And we continue here for a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.